The war had ended, but survival had only just begun. In the first winter after World War II, cities lay in ruins. Supply trains had stopped, farmlands were bare, and for millions of families, the fight wasn't for victory anymore. It was for the next meal, the next fire, the next morning. They didn't have modern gear, stocked supermarkets, or working utilities. What they had were a handful of hard-learned tricks, passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, designed to keep people alive when the cold closed in. These weren't battlefield tactics. They were the everyday survival methods that meant the difference between making it through the night or not at all. And even now, decades later, these same tricks still work and could save your family when winter turns unforgiving. Number 1. Potato peel fire starters. In the first winter after World War II, fire wasn't just about comfort. It was survival. Many homes no longer had working stoves. Coal yards were empty. Forests near villages had already been stripped bare for firewood. And for countless families, the challenge wasn't just keeping a fire going. It was finding something dry enough to start one in the first place. That's when an unlikely solution began to spread, one that came not from a forest, but from the kitchen table. Potato peels. For families lucky enough to still have a few potatoes in storage, nothing was wasted, not even the skins. After peeling, those scraps were laid out in the sun, hung near stoves, or placed on cloth above fireplaces to dry completely. Once crisp, they became a surprising source of fuel. The reason was simple. Potato skins contain natural oils and starches that burn hotter and longer than paper or straw. Even a handful could catch a spark and feed it long enough to ignite larger pieces of wood. In rural villages, children were often given the job of collecting and drying peels. Buckets of them would be saved through the week, ready for the next fire. In cities, where sunlight was scarce and air was damp, people dried peels in cloth sacks near any remaining source of warmth, sometimes even in their own coat pockets as they worked or traveled. When it came time to use them, the dried peels were placed at the base of the fire pit or stove, often mixed with bits of paper, bark, or broken twigs. Once lit, they burned with an oily smoke that gripped onto kindling and made the flame more stable. In freezing rain or deep snow, this little boost could mean the difference between a failed fire and a warm home. It wasn't just about the heat, it was about independence. In the first post-war winter, there was no guarantee of outside help. Every home had to find its own way to keep warm, and potato peels became a small but vital part of that effort. Even today, this trick still works. If you're camping, preparing for a blackout, or simply wanting to stretch your supplies, saving and drying your potato skins can give you a reliable, free source of fire-starting material. They store for months, take up little space, and work when matches alone won't. Because in a world where warmth can be the difference between hardship and hope, even a peel can keep the fire alive. Number 2 lantern wicks from twisted yarn. After World War II, the nights felt longer than ever. Many villages had no electricity. Power lines lay tangled on the ground. Oil lamps and kerosene lanterns became the only source of light for millions of people. But there was a new problem. The wicks that made those lanterns burn were wearing out, and replacements were almost impossible to find. That's when families turned to something humble yet surprisingly effective: old yarn. Wool sweaters, knitted scarves, and wool blankets that had grown thin with age became more than just clothing. By unraveling these items, families could salvage long strands of yarn. The best came from tightly woven garments, where the fibers had stayed strong despite years of wear. The process was patient work. First, the yarn was untangled and straightened. Then, several strands were twisted together, tighter and tighter, until they formed a single, thicker cord. This twisting not only increased strength, but also made the fibers more uniform, allowing oil to soak evenly when used as a wick. To prepare it for burning, the twisted yarn was often dipped in melted candle wax, leftover cooking fat, or even cold lamp oil. This treatment gave the wick structure, making it easier to light and more resistant to fraying. Once set, it could be threaded into the lantern and trimmed to the right length. These handmade wicks didn't last as long as factory-made ones, but they worked, and in those days, That was enough. Every evening, people carefully adjusted the wick height to control the flame, trimming the burned ends to keep the light steady. In the darkness of a snow-covered farmhouse or a bomb-damaged apartment, that small, steady glow was more than just illumination. It was a reminder that they had found a way forward, even without the supplies they once took for granted. This method spread quickly through towns and rural communities. Neighbors traded yarn for oil, mothers taught children to twist the strands evenly, and no piece of worn-out clothing was ever thrown away without first removing anything that could be turned into light. Today, the same trick still holds value. In a power outage, during a camping trip, or in a long-term emergency, you can replace a burned-out wick with nothing more than an old sweater and a few minutes of work. With some patience, a little wax, and a steady hand, you can keep your light burning when store shelves are empty. Because after the war, they didn't just live in the dark. They found ways to bring the light back. Number 3. Ice block meat safes. The winter after World War II, refrigeration was a luxury few could even imagine. Power grids had been destroyed, factory ice production was gone, and in villages where hunting or barter still brought in meat, keeping it from spoiling became just as important as finding it in the first place. The answer came from something nature was already providing: ice. Families living near rivers, ponds, or frozen lakes learned to cut large blocks of ice straight from the source. Using hand saws, chisels, or even sharpened scrap metal, they carved out chunks weighing as much as a grown man could carry. These blocks were heavy, cold, and difficult to move, but in those days, they were worth more than gold. Once cut, the ice blocks were wrapped in layers of straw or sawdust to slow melting, then placed inside wooden crates or barrels. These makeshift containers became what many called meat safes. A single block could keep a small crate cold for weeks, even when stored in a barn or root cellar. By packing meat, fish, and dairy alongside the ice, and surrounding it all with more straw, families could preserve their food well into the spring. In towns, where rivers were frozen but space was limited, people buried the ice-filled crates underground. The Earth's natural insulation, combined with the ice's cold, kept the temperature just above freezing. In rural areas, some built entire ice houses, simple sheds lined with thick wood walls and a packed floor of sawdust. These structures allowed them to store not just meat, but butter, milk, and even certain vegetables that would otherwise spoil in a few days. The beauty of this method was its simplicity. No electricity, no chemicals, just ice, insulation, and patience. The key was making sure the ice stayed as solid as possible, which meant keeping it away from direct sunlight and never letting warm air circulate inside the crate. Even after the war, in places where rebuilding took years, ice block safes remained a vital part of winter survival. They were proof that preservation didn't always require machines, just an understanding of how to work with the season instead of against it. Today, this old method still works. In a long-term power outage, if winter temperatures are low enough, anyone can replicate it. A frozen block, a container, and some insulation can turn a simple box into a reliable cold storage space. It's a skill worth remembering. Not because it's quaint, but because when modern systems fail, it's the simplest solutions that keep you fed. Because after the war, survival didn't come from what people bought. It came from what they built with their own hands. Number 4. Charcoal-dusted snow. Melt water. First winter. After World War II, water was not the simple necessity it is today. Bombed pipelines lay in twisted heaps beneath the streets. Wells were frozen solid. Streams and rivers, once clear, now carried the debris of war. For many families, the only accessible water came from the snow under their feet, and even that came with a risk. Snow looks pure, but it can trap dust, ash, and unseen particles that make it taste foul or upset the stomach. People needed a way to make melted snow safer. Without chemicals, filters, or boiling fuel, they couldn't spare. That's when an old trick began to circulate, adding a pinch of charcoal dust. Charcoal was already common in most homes that used wood or coal stoves. By crushing a small piece of clean, burned wood into fine powder, families created a natural purifier. When a little of this dust was stirred into freshly melted snow water, it absorbed impurities, trapped odors, and settled unwanted particles to the bottom of the pot. The method was straightforward. First, clean snow was gathered from fresh drifts, never the top layer exposed to soot, and never from areas near chimneys or roadways. It was packed into a metal pot and set near a fire, just close enough to melt slowly without scorching. Once the water formed, a pinch of charcoal dust was sprinkled in and stirred gently. The water was then left to sit for a short time, allowing the charcoal to work and the sediment to sink. Afterward, the liquid could be poured carefully into another container, leaving the darker residue behind. The result was clearer, better-tasting water, and while it wasn't a perfect purification method, it was safer and far more palatable than drinking snowmelt on its own. For soldiers stationed in remote posts and civilians trapped in snowbound towns, this trick made winter survival just a little more bearable. It didn't require extra fuel, and it turned something as basic as snow into a dependable water source without wasting scarce resources. Even today, the principle still works. In a winter emergency, clean charcoal from a campfire can help remove some of the unpleasant taste and visible impurities from melted snow. It's not a replacement for full filtration, but when resources are limited, it can be the difference between drinking something barely tolerable and having water you can rely on. Because in those first winters after the war, survival wasn't about perfection. It was about making what you had just good enough to keep going. Number 5, eggshell powder for nutrition. Hunger didn't vanish when the war ended. It simply changed shape. Streets were quieter, but kitchens were still empty. Meat was rare, dairy was a luxury, and fresh vegetables almost impossible to find. The struggle wasn't just filling stomachs, it was keeping bodies strong when diets lacked the nutrients people once relied on. That's when families began turning to something they had always thrown away: eggshells. Eggs themselves were precious, often bought one at a time or traded for labor. But when a family managed to get them, the shells didn't go to waste. They were collected, washed, and boiled to kill any lingering bacteria. Once dried, the shells were ground into a fine powder, sometimes with a mortar and pestle, other times by wrapping them in cloth and crushing them with a rolling pin or stone. This powder wasn't for decoration. It was a source of calcium, one of the most vital nutrients for bones, teeth, and muscle function. In normal times, milk or cheese would provide it, but with livestock herds reduced, dairy was often unavailable. Eggshell powder became a quiet, hidden supplement in the diets of post-war families. Mothers stirred a spoonful into bread dough, where it blended unnoticed among the flour. Some mixed it into porridge or soups, giving the meal a faint crunch, but adding strength to otherwise thin rations. Children were encouraged to eat it without knowing, because the priority wasn't taste, it was survival. The practice spread quickly in rural areas where hens were more common, but even in cities, those with access to markets or barter systems saved every shell they could. In some households, the powder was kept in small jars next to salt or sugar, always ready to stretch the benefits of the next meal. It wasn't perfect. Eggshell powder couldn't replace a balanced diet. But it was one more tool in the fight against malnutrition, a fight that was just as real after the war as it had been during it. Today, the same method is still used by homesteaders and survivalists. In a long-term crisis, when supplements run out and fresh food is limited, turning kitchen scraps into nutrition could mean the difference between lasting the winter and growing weaker with each passing week. Because survival wasn't just about finding food, it was about finding the strength to keep going, even in what you thought was waste. Number 6, rope beds from salvaged wire. Cold floors were more than just uncomfortable. They drained the body's heat with every passing minute. For families sleeping in basements, abandoned buildings, or makeshift shelters after the war, the ground itself became an enemy. Bedding was thin, blankets were scarce, and every night felt colder than the one before. The solution came from an unexpected source: the ruins around them. In bomb-damaged neighborhoods, twisted lengths of wire lay scattered among the rubble, pulled from collapsed walls, fencing, and broken machinery. To most, they looked useless. But for those who understood the problem, salvaged wire became the foundation for something far more valuable: rope beds. The process was simple, but it required patience and strong hands. First, long pieces of wire were stripped from debris, carefully straightened, and cut into manageable lengths. These strands were then woven across a wooden or metal frame, crisscrossing in tight patterns until they formed a flexible mesh. The mesh acted as a barrier, lifting sleeping mats, straw pallets, or folded blankets several inches above the frozen floor. By keeping the sleeper off the ground, heat loss was drastically reduced. Cold air couldn't steal warmth as quickly, and dampness from the earth no longer soaked into bedding. Even without a mattress, the woven surface was softer and far more insulating than lying directly on stone or dirt. In rural areas, farmers sometimes combined the wire mesh with rope made from old clothing strips, blending strength with a bit of comfort. In towns, salvaged bed frames were repaired using wire when original springs had rusted or broken. Nothing was wasted. Even short scraps of wire were twisted together to form longer strands. These rope beds became especially important for the elderly and the sick, who were most at risk from sleeping in the cold. A simple elevated frame could mean fewer illnesses and more strength to face each day. The idea wasn't new. Rope beds had existed for centuries. But in the aftermath of the war, the materials had changed. Instead of store-bought rope, people used whatever they could scavenge. And in doing so, they proved that comfort could still be built from ruin. Today, the principle remains just as relevant. In a survival situation, even a few inches of elevation can protect you from losing vital body heat at night. Whether it's salvaged wire, paracord, or any strong material you can weave, keeping yourself off the ground is one of the simplest and most effective ways to stay warm. Because when the cold tried to steal their strength, they built something to hold it in. Number 7. Boot liners from felted wool scraps. Snow crept in through every crack and seam, soaking socks and numbing toes within minutes. For those walking long distances in the winters after the war, frozen feet weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. With proper winter boots nearly impossible to find and supplies reserved for soldiers, civilians had to make do with what they had. That's when an old material, often discarded as useless, found a new purpose: felted wool scraps. Wool was already known for its warmth, but when compressed and layered into felt, it became even more effective at trapping heat and repelling moisture. Tailors, cobblers, and families began collecting every scrap of worn-out coats, damaged hats, and threadbare blankets they could find. Even pieces too small to patch clothing were saved, sorted, and cleaned. The process was straightforward but required careful work. Small pieces were layered together, sometimes stitched, sometimes pressed with heat and moisture to bond them into thicker sheets. These sheets were then cut to match the outline of a boot's sole, with extra pieces shaped to line the sides and heel. In homes without sewing tools, the wool was simply packed tightly into the boot, molded over time by the wearer's foot. The difference was immediate. With the felt layer inside, boots held warmth far longer and shielded feet from the cold that radiated up from icy ground. Dampness, though still a threat, took longer to penetrate, giving wearers more time before needing to dry their footwear. For children walking to school, farmers tending animals, or traders carrying goods between villages, this simple addition could mean the difference between numb feet and the ability to keep moving. In many towns, the making of boot liners became a community effort. People brought scraps to central gathering places where Women and older men who could no longer work heavy labor spent hours cutting and stitching liners for others. It wasn't charity, it was survival, shared equally among those who contributed. Sometimes the liners were doubled up for the elderly or those working outdoors all day. Some households even made removable pairs so they could be dried near the fire each night, ready to use again by morning. This reuse was crucial. Wool was too valuable to waste, and a well-made liner could last through multiple winters. Today, this trick remains just as useful. In a long-term power outage or a severe winter storm, keeping your feet warm and dry is one of the most important steps in protecting your health. Even if you don't have modern insulating gear, the same principle applies. Layer, compress, and fit any insulating material you have into your boots. Because after the war, they didn't just walk through the cold. They found a way to carry warmth with them, step after step. The war had ended, but the fight to survive had only begun. Those first winters tested more than strength. They tested ingenuity, patience, and the will to keep moving when the world outside your door was frozen solid. Every trick, every scrap, every small act of preparation was a step between enduring the season and being overcome by it. These weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. Heated stones tucked into beds, makeshift ropes and salvaged wire turned into support, boot liners stitched from forgotten wool, and food stretched further with whatever could be found. None of it was easy, but it was done. Because the choice wasn't between comfort and hardship. It was between hardship and nothing at all. We may never face the same winters they did, but the lesson remains. Strength doesn't always come from what you own. Sometimes it comes from what you can create with your own two hands, when no one else is coming to help. If you believe knowledge like this should never be lost, if you want to be ready for the moment when comfort disappears without warning, and if you respect the wisdom of those who survived the hardest seasons, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now and keep these lessons alive, because one day they may be the only thing standing between you and the cold.